Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop in Exton, Pennsylvania. And it's so, I want to say it again because this is a particularly poignant one for me. It's great to be doing this and for these people, these great authors to talk to me. And what's cool about today's guest, Paul Harding, is that I interviewed him, I think in 2010 before, which makes me realize I'm 13 years older.
Me too.
Which makes me realize, that this is, Inan, Tinkers, Inan, and this a new book, This Other Eden. Well, all right, that's enough of that. And you got to watch me, Paul, because I'll end up talking the whole time. So I'll try and make it quick. Okay. So anyway, here we go. I already have it going. All right. Our guest today, as I said, is Paul Harding. He's the author of Pulitzer Prize winning Tinkers, like I said, more than a decade ago, and then follow up with Inan that deals with characters that also were involved in Tinkers. And now This Other Eden that also includes Inan, and we're going to talk about that. It's published by Norton. It'll be released on the 24th. So Malaga Island is just west of Phippsburg on the mainland of, just west of Phippsburg, which is on the mainland of Maine, across from the New Meadows River and just east of Bear Island. And it was the home of an excerpt from the Maine Coast Heritage Trust and kind of an epigraph to this novel, a mixed-race fishing community in the mid-1800s and through 1912 when the state evicted all 47 residents, placing some in homes for the feeble-minded. They also exhumed the bodies of Malaga's dead and placed them in, I think, 5 coffins and reburied them in a kind of pauper cemetery. There were a couple of half-hearted apologies kind of codified in 2010 by the state legislature and a small scholarship fund of a paltry $500,000, which was subsequently reduced to $300,000 for the benefit of the descendants of the former inhabitants. And they called it, they said they profoundly regretted it, which, whatever. And so Paul tells us the story of the families that lived there, how they came about, how they were torn apart, including a longer story going back to some old country about Ethan, an artist, and Bridget, a maid, and a friend, and more to Ethan. And Paul brings us back to a place that we've already visited. It's kind of a lodestone for his writing. So let's find out more about who these people were, for good and bad, and how their story touches us, infuriates us at times, and gives us a kind of nuanced idea of what families really are. So welcome, Paul. Thanks for coming again.
Thanks for having me, Sam. It's a great pleasure, great honor to talk with you again.
So why Malaga? How did you pick it?
Oh, it's, it takes me so long to write novels and to come up with ideas for them.
Oh.
One of the everything just sort of just happens by accident. And it's come down to kind of the way I've learned over the course of these 3 novels, the way that I just actually write, the way that I compose, which is the first couple of years are just like, just riffing, just improvising, and just, sometimes people say, do you not read certain books when you're writing? So like the plausible deniability or something like that. I'm like, everything I read goes right into my manuscript. I'm a magpie. I think that synthesis is kind of the key. And so I just do a lot of experimenting and trying out different things and kind of whatever I'm interested in at the time. So the actual germ for the book was, I knew it wasn't going to be the main book, but I had to have something just to start riffing on and to start kind of like building up. So I thought of a minor character from the second novel, Inan, who's this woman, Mrs. Hale, in that book, who is like a nonagenarian. She's very old, and she has this kind of funny scene toward the end of Inan. And I really love that, her estate is based on, like Inan is, I grew up in a little town on the North Shore of Boston called Wenham, and it was originally called Inan. So it's sort of fictional version of the village I grew up in. And so she's the grande dame. She owns this estate. Anyways, I just thought, well, what would be kind of interesting would be to take her and just start riffing about her when she was like a 10-year-old kid, which would have been kind of early 20th century. So I named her Phoebe. And I just kind of had this scene where she and her mother and maybe some cousins or whatever are just in the meadow of this. They own a big estate and they're just in the meadow, kind of like having tea or picnic, again, like I was just very, very just riffing and just trying to write about the meadow and this and that and the other thing. And at the same time, I'm a junkie for painting, and I really, really, really love still life and landscape painting. So I was reading about this 19th century artist named Charles Ethan Porter, who did landscapes and flowers and still lifes. And I came upon one of his paintings. It was a big painting of a meadow that had been mowed. And so it was that there were haystacks in a meadow. And so I, had this scene going with this character and her mother and so I just literally just plunked a guy out in the, in like the depth of the field, like the long shot behind this scene. There's just some guy out painting in the field. And then I was reading, as one does, about the history of organized labor after the Civil War. And, the unions were some of the first institutions in the United States that advocated for civil rights, for women's suffrage, because when you have these working class communities, and they tend to be integrated, they tend to be mixed, Oakland, California is one of the great, kind of examples of that. So I was just Googling, like literally just sort of like, I was thinking about, after the Civil War, there must have been all Black communities and there must have been racially integrated communities. And so I was just sort of just futzing around and I came upon the story of Malaga. And Malaga was in southern Maine. And I was like, Tinkers is part of Tinkers. A lot of Tinkers is set in Maine. My grandparents are from Maine. I kind of just, Maine resonates with me. And then I found out that some of the people, when they were evicted from Malaga, were consigned to this place called the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, which you can imagine. And that was the school, one of the schools that there's a character in Tinkers that almost is going to be committed to a place that was sort of based on the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. So when you're early on, I'm just like walking around the dowsing rod, just like, ooh, that, there's something twitching, and then I find, you're always saying, the universe, give me a sign. Am I on to something? And then just by coincidence, I discovered that I think it was at least the same month, I think it was July of 1912, the first International Congress on Eugenics was taking place in London. And I was just like, I think that's it. I think there's this little constellation of enough that it just started to kind of vibrate for me. And so then when I looped back to this nascent little manuscript I had, I realized, I don't know what the connection is, but I know that the guy who's out in the meadow, who's out painting in the meadow, is kind of like a refugee or something from Malaga Island. How did he get there? And that was it. I was just kind of off. I just, had these different, I just started building up different sections. I mean, I'm not very organized. I'm not very linear. I just kind of go all over the place. I'm like those little robot vacuum cleaners, that just bounce off of things, and someday I'll get everything written or vacuum cleaner. So that's what it was. And then I just, very quickly, kind of when you find out a little bit about the history of Malaga, I didn't want it to be an historical novel per se. I wanted to take, I only read like 2 or 3 or 4 articles that were available at the time about it. I didn't want to write a historical novel. I felt like that is like, there's always that kind of space where you're thinking, okay, on the one hand, the island is now a state, it's now a state park, and this is part of Maine, New England, US human history, right? So there's this kind of common domain aspect of it. But I didn't feel it wasn't my story to tell in a nonfiction way or in a, like kind of point for point. So I deliberately did what Henry James always said, which is when he got a kernel of something from real life, he'd say, you do just enough, you find just enough to pique your appetite and your curiosity, but not enough to satisfy it, you know? And so what I did is I set about trying to get an imagined version of something like Malaga Island. I tried to, work it up so it gained its own kind of imaginary critical mass or momentum. And, just went from there and just writing.
It's funny you mentioned Henry James, because I remember you were going to be teaching that class of the Henry James novella when you found out about the Pulitzer Prize.
That's right. I was going to teach The Beast in the Jungle, I think.
Yeah, which is a great.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the great masterpieces, just absolute masterpiece of a story.
Well, that brings me back to what I thought about in the introduction is like, I could ask it in a silly way. Are you always going to have Inan in all of your books?
It's one of the, again, it's so far. I mean, I'm not, right now, I'm not saying, what, who's going to come past the screen, who's going to come through Inan again. But there is something, so much of this stuff just ends up being, when you're an artist, you got to make your own breaks. You got to engage yourself. You have to surprise yourself, please yourself, bring yourself joy, with the presumption that if the deepest and best feelings that writing the book give you are the ones you want to pass on to the reader who follows behind you, And one of the things I love is like in Yoknapatawpha, Faulkner's, he's Uncle Bill, kind of thing. I love, and a lot of these so-called magical realists did this too. This is another thing that I really loved about reading like Carlos Fuentes and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Cortázar and all those folks, is I love reading a novel and in the background of a scene, somebody who's the protagonist of another novel that you've read kind of walks by in the background, and suddenly the novel you're reading is bigger, it's more spacious because it's suddenly interconnected, it's synthesized with another tradition or another set of novels. And that's just, even just technically is like, I've discovered and experimented with just that idea of getting any given novel to feel like it's actually bigger than one novel, that it's interconnected with the whole universe, really.
It's funny because talking about magical realism, because I was going to say this and I was thinking, am I insulting him? But like, if you read you
can't insult me, Sam.
If you read your sentences sometime, if I wrote a sentence like that in my English literature class when I made in college, they would have, this is the most run-on sentence I've ever heard. Where is punctuation? And then I thought about it. And then when you read it, because, in your interview, you say, plot is not your primary concern, but when you read those, sometimes it's poetry, sometimes it's like a fever dream, and sometimes it's like Molly Bloom's soliloquy.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, first you go, wait a minute, this sentence is never going to end. And then you realize it is the way it is because that's the way it should be. But no one, very few authors would dare to do what you do.
It's personal disposition, you know what I mean? Like, it's personal taste. It certainly wasn't in fashion. When I was getting my MFA program, I spent a few, workshops sitting there while everybody said, this isn't like Raymond Carver, St. Raymond or The Highway kind of, and I was just like, I just don't write that way. I don't think that way. I love big sentences. I love language, and more is more. And so that's just another thing that I spend that I'm pleased and lucky to spend my time doing, which is I have this kind of ideal of like the maximum density of meaning that any given sentence can contain, but also coupled with the ideal of maximum lucidity. So you want to have as much as possible, but make it so it's not abstruse. You make it so it's not exhausting to read. So total clarity and total, just richness of meaning, and not ornamental meaning, essential meaning.
Well, it's mesmerizing, and two things. One is it has nothing to do with the plot, which is great. Or sometimes it has nothing to do with the plot. And the other thing is, because the way I look at good books is, I did learn everything about Malaga because of you.
Yeah, right.
I looked at every YouTube video. And then the other thing is I looked at every picture by the artist that you modeled after, and I realized his art is a lot like your writing.
Yeah, it's funny. It's and again, that's, you know, I throw paintings in and music in, and, you know, I was just kind of, you know, and I love the idea that the book is just layer after layer after layer after layer of, like, I could take you through the whole book and tell you where every sentence came from, every author I was thinking of, every composer, every painter, whatever. And I just love that. I love it's the privilege of influence. But then when I go back and I read my favorite authors, they're all doing that too. You know, it's like Shakespeare. You know, Shakespeare didn't have an original idea. He just went and took stories that already existed and just did better versions of them than anybody. And then Melville took Shakespeare and Moses, and, you know, it's the synthesis of these sorts of things.
But you said something about, who was it? Maybe I was reading something else about, if I was really good, I could write the worst couplet that Shakespeare.
I can't remember that. Yeah, that idea of just like at my very. I remember with Tinkers, like my favorite. I think my favorite sentence in Tinkers is the sentence that just reads, "Behold and be a genius." And I was like, Emerson could have written that on a bad day. You know, like that. Just that, like. You just kind of invoke.
I know, it's like William Carlos Williams in The Red Wheelbarrow, or it's like in flash fiction, it's like Ernest Hemingway. I don't think he really did it, but, you know, for sale, baby shoes never worn.
Yep, never. I mean, right.
God, you know, and why does that do that to the reader? And that's what you do. And go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, it's all just interrogative. It's all just trying to really, you know, work with the language and see what it is. I'm also just a junkie for the dictionary. And I mean, like the OED. I have 2 of the full printed, full size.
I have them in the bookstore too.
And I go back and forth because the older one has different definitions. They're worded differently, you know. And I just spend lots of time looking at just regular words that we use out of habit, but without thinking.
And I'm like you. Like, if I want to write a short story, I'll go to Audell's book, Handy Book of Electricity.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And just find the words. And I love reading all the quotes throughout the history of the word, because then even if you just use it in a slightly more precise way, and with a way in which cumulatively the sentences just resonate more deeply, because you're just kind of working with them with a kind of like a deeper Z axis, or, you know, like a deeper time axis. So they start to take on that kind of, or you're trying to get them to take on that kind of slightly more eternal kind of quality. Because with this book, I was really trying to get, like, you're right there with the characters and they're smoking their pipes, and you can taste the brine and, you know, all the whatever. But I
wouldn't want to drink that tea, and I wouldn't want to smoke that crap.
I know. It's really crazy. I wanted to be right there, but I also wanted to have this, you know, and it's right from the beginning. It's like Eden. It's like there's a flood at the beginning. It's like Noah's Ark. The island is also like the Pequod. Like there's a scene where all the characters at the beginning are on a tree, and the tree is sinking, which is the Pequod at the end of Moby Dick. And then when the water goes down, it's like as if the Pequod rose. But yeah, I'm just having fun. And it's like the tempest.
It's like going back to magical realism. So first, you think the author is telling the truth, you know, and then you realize an author can lie about everything. That's great. And then, so look, I'm reading it, and you set it up perfectly. You know, the grandma's in the rocking chair, she's smoking her pipe, and they're begging her to tell the story of the hurricane. And that's the perfect setup. And then she tells the story of the hurricane. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, did this hurricane actually happen? And was it like this? And I realized there's no hurricane. That couldn't have possibly happened.
Right, the tall tale. It's a local flood narrative. You know, yeah, and I love doing that. I love, as you know, people look at the book, I love using all sorts of different types of texts and idioms and genres, because you can vary your voice and the texture of the language, and you can give the reader all sorts of different points of views. And I just, you know, one of the things that was really fun about doing this big set piece that opens the book about this hurricane is I got to use that slightly kind of exaggerated tall tale kind of a voice. And it was really fun having me thinking, oh, it's the character telling this. And I would keep switching into first person, as if she was so involved in it that she'd start to, and just, I don't know, you know, again, just kind of making it really just like multivalent and sort of like kind of slightly, yeah, kind of like magical realism, sort of trippy, you know, but absolutely I try to make every single word absolutely concrete. And again, this goes back to Shakespeare. I teach Shakespeare all the time. Every line that Shakespeare writes means what it says and says what it means, and it works literally. Like it means what it says literally first, but then you start getting these literal sentences in, you know, aggregations, and figurative meaning starts to kind of resonate, and you start to get all these overtones and undertones, and then you kind of choreograph those.
And the other thing about a good book is, you know, after I read the line about the couplets, then I had a, you know, I'm spending a lot of time. I stayed up till 3 o'clock in the morning doing this crap last night. And then I went to Shakespeare because of that stupid couplet line. Then I go to Shakespeare and I find myself in the middle of the night reading his sonnets to see which is worse, which are his first two lines.
I know. Yeah. No,
but
I know.
So if you go into a more prosaic, you know, the hurricane is what the hurricane is. But then you go and the two dogs are the two dogs. But Grizzly,
right,
like the dog, and then he goes, is it Charlotte he grabs? I forgot.
Yeah, I think it's one of the little sisters.
One of the two sisters. But you know, and then when he won't go, and then when he, you know, he's like this Cerberus, you know, he's like,
it's great, yeah. And you know, and it's like that's one of the things I had to learn as a writer, is that discipline of just like, your job is just to pick up the shovel and just keep digging the, you know, just get the sentences so they mean exactly, you know, so they're, because you have faith in the language and the, you know, the kind of inner coherence, and then you have faith in the reader that, like, you know, he's got to be a real dog first, and then you start the reader will say, oh, but, you know, and then if you're doing the writing correctly, the writing will say, yep, you know, it'll encourage you to come, it'll invite you deeper into that kind of experience. And, you know, but Grizzly, I just started off like, oh, you know what? I think he's got some Newfoundlander in him. And, you know, Newfoundlanders are famous for, if you've got little kids and they're swimming, the Newfoundlanders will just go out and they'll just get the kid by the neck, and they'll rescue them from drowning. And so I just thought, I just had this thing with this little kid is just so mad at this big dog, and the dog is just doing
plus the reader's going, what a cool dog, which is
great. Yeah. I love there's a bunch of dogs in this, you know, on this island. And I had a great, wonderful time. Like, they ended up becoming characters, you know.
That's what I was getting at. And the other, but then, okay, approach it from a different way. A short sentence where you go like, an ocean dreaming of its own depths. You know, that's something that I think that language is language that I really am in love with, because I don't know exactly what it means. So it's like poetry, but at the same time, I know exactly what it means. Right. Yeah.
And that's what I love getting, you know, so it's that thing where, you know, I say this to my students, you know, they want to get to meaning with a capital M, right? And they want to use metaphor, you know, and I say, you know, metaphor is a Greek word, right? But you're trying to get the meta without the foreign, you know, that's the, you know, and you know, so meta means over and above, but the other part of that word foreign, P-H-O-R-E-I-N, is Greek for that which stands on its own. So you have to have the thing that stands on its own first before you can get meta with it, you know? So, and again, this is just like anecdotal kind of, but one of the things that I learned writing Tinkers was, what I'm trying to do is actually, I'm not trying to become transcendent. I'm trying to go as deeply into immanence as possible. Very Husserl, man, you know, very phenomenological, very experiential, but just that, what is it like? And there's a weird thing where if you get, the more literal you get and the more precise, it's almost like you get surreal, like more precise than, you know, there's this point where it almost turns inside out, and you start to get those, it's like Wallace Stevens, you know, all those things about, you know, this is where the serpent lives. And you're sort of like, I understand every single word he's saying, but I can't, it's mystical. It's something kind of like, you know, descriptions in the Bible where they, you know, put the things together with the wings and everything in the book of Daniel, and you're like, I have no idea what that looks like, but I can see all the different parts.
Or like Ezekiel and the wheel and the, you know.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
When I was a kid, I thought this was the coolest thing ever. You know?
Yeah, and that's, you know, and I teach the Old Testament. You know, I go back and forth between Shakespeare and the Old Testament. There's a lot to learn. You know, I mean,
well, you know, all you're saying is why you won the damn thing. I mean, Olive Kittredge is Olive Kittredge, and what you did is not Olive Kittredge. And tell you the truth, I like your stuff better.
Well, yeah, that's super important. Is that at a certain point, it's just a matter of taste, right?
Correct.
That's one of the things. That's another thing I tell my students. It's so counterintuitive, or it's so like obvious but I say, don't write your books for people who won't like them.
Well, another insult. Yeah, there's people who would read Tinkers and go, this is crap, you know?
Oh, there sure were. Oh yeah. Yep. I actually did. There used to be that reading series in New York called Happy Endings, you know? And it was like, the trick was that after you read, you had to do something on stage that you'd never otherwise do in front of other people. That's a big draw for the right. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And up until the very minute that the minute I finished my reading, I realized I know what I'm going to do, because I had my first iPhone, and I went on and I did a dramatic reading of all the 1-star reviews of Tinkers on Amazon.
You know,
you got that? Like, you call this a flippin' novel?
I went to this restaurant in San Francisco, and you go into the bathroom and they have this loop of all the horrible reviews. The worst hamburger I've ever had in my life. And it was so funny. And I was so proud of them for doing that, you know?
Yeah, my favorite during that reading was somebody whose review, just 1-star review. And the review was, tinker with boredom much. I was like, tip of the hat. That's great. You know,
I'll just like reading Yelp reviews of restaurants, because these people spend a lot of time writing these reviews. And I start laughing like Larry David uproariously. I can't help it, you know?
Yeah. Or, you know, you go and you know, sort of, you read, you know, that the person will have a 1-star review of your book, and then they'll give like a 5-star review to, like, you know, fingernail polish or something. It's so funny. You know?
For a hotel, they'll say that, you know, the shower head nozzle was calcified.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, but I think that goes back to, you know, you gotta go all in, you know, what you really love and what you really want, and not be self-conscious about it, you know. And that's also just endlessly absorbing to me, which is the type of writing that I want to do and that I want to pull off. This is true of anybody, so no matter what style, like, it doesn't have to do with this, but it's, if you write a certain way and you're aspiring to write a certain way, first of all, I tell my students, don't be self-aware, don't be self-conscious. You should be trying to write a great book. You should be trying to write a book that if it wins the Pulitzer, you won't be embarrassed or whatever.
Well, it's easy to say, but it's really hard. It's like telling someone, why can't you just be happy?
It's actually a skill that you have to learn. Like, it's actually, you have to build it up like a muscle, right? To not be. Then the second you stop writing and you're in your private time as a citizen, you know, you can be freaking out, but like, when you do it, you can't be distracted, you know. But then so anyway, I just meant to say that no matter what type of writing you do, every type of writing comes with a certain number of predictable potential. Like, there would be predictable ways that when that type of writing goes wrong, it'll go horribly wrong in very predictable ways. You know,
the other thing you say to your students is, you know, when you're writing, don't think about your book all of a sudden has a dust jacket on it on the inside flap. It says $29.95.
Right.
You know, that's
exactly.
You're
exactly.
not right.
Yeah, that's my you know, teachers, Marilyn Robinson and Elizabeth McCracken, both were just like, do not think about publishing when you're writing, you know. And when my students say, what's the best way for me to, you know, how do I get an agent? How do I get you know, what do agents want? What do editors want? I just say, they want a good book. You just write the best possible. The best chance you have of getting an agent, the best chance you have of getting published is writing the best book you possibly can.
Well, going back to the book, because we're trying to sell the book.
Yeah.
Well, I'll put it on the front table, so I'll sell your book. And it'll be in the book club too, that's where.
Oh, great.
That's where you'll have the fights, because someone's going to say, I didn't understand why he would do such a thing.
Oh, I know. There's always that. Yeah.
Which is fine. You should want that, actually.
And that's another thing I have great fun doing, which I've come to call it kind of, or think of it informally as like the Queen Lear phenomenon, which is you try to keep the reader's attention on every sentence is so engrossing. That's the ideal. That's what you're shooting for. So engrossing that nobody ever stops to say, where's Queen Lear? Those girls needed a mother as a role model. It's like, that's not the story Shakespeare's telling you, you know?
Yeah, but that's, yeah. You know what? Another way of coming at it is, and this surprised me. So Timothy, when he goes there to serve the eviction notices,
Yeah.
and then he's anguished, but is he anguished the same way that the teacher is because he can't stand the sight of a Negro, which you modeled after somebody else too. But then when he goes home to his wife and she puts her arm on his shoulder, and all of a sudden I felt sorry for him.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's another thing too, which is the way that you get depth and the way that you get character, you know, and depth of character, et cetera, is, you know, people are always mixtures of better and worse impulses, right? So I don't want that guy. He's such a relatively small role in the book. So I didn't want to just bring him on stage and just, you know, have it be a straw man and just beat him, you know. And so his anguish is real, and his wife really loves him, and they have a child, and he has a miserably racist attitude, and his wife loves him, and he loves his wife. And I think that's one of the ways that you also respect the reader, is you can put those two opposite impulses right next to each other, and you don't tell the reader what it's, you know, the reader can,
which is what I did
that themselves.
Well, the other thing, it's all in 2 paragraphs.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, right.
Which is really hard to do, because you're developing, well, you know, in all your books, you have all these characters floating around.
Yeah.
And you think, okay, well, he's not important, but then you go back and you go, oh, yeah. Yeah. And it's again, I get, that's not plot driven though.
No, it's all, it goes back to Husserl. Everything is phenomenological. Everything is experiential. Everything is, so like going back to when you were talking about, you know, like say describing a storm or describing a landscape or something, everything is always through a point of view. And so it's always at least partially whatever you're reading, even if it's just a descriptive passage, it is the experience of a landscape or of telling a story, rather than just the thing, you know, the storm per se. It's always what it's like for the people listening to the story, or for the person telling the story of the flood in that example.
Well, it's like when you do, and I don't want to spoil anything, so the readers won't understand the listeners won't understand what I'm saying, but I don't care. So like you have this mother who's going to do something because she's had this baby, and then she does something else instead. Well,
yeah.
And it's like, you know, it's foreshadowed before, and you actually have it happening.
Yep.
And it was so easy, you know, so easy.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is just also just being that kind of improvisational, you know, you have a sense of, there she was in these circumstances. She's a young kid, basically, you know, young, you know, 12 or 13 years old, and she's just had a child. And so you just say action. And, you know, my job is I'm the amanuensis, right? I literally think of it as like I open the hatch and I take the ladder down into that scene. And my job is just to shut up and just look and listen, no presumptions, and just moment by moment, what is it like for her? And the thing about it improvises what happens in that too, you know.
The thing about it is, I can see it perfectly. I can visualize it right now with his pipe right on the edge, worrying about if she pushes any harder, what will happen? It's so cinematic, which reminds me, I always wondered why, I assume your books get optioned, but this one would be really a cool movie.
I don't know. It's funny. They haven't been one of them's maybe being optioned now. But I don't know.
It would be hard.
I never think about movies. I don't think, like, I think about painterly or photographically, I think about light a lot, and I think about color a lot. And again, because light and color are refracting through a character's experience of them. So, so you just end up with each character, you end up with like palettes, color palettes and, verbal palettes or whatever, all that sort of stuff. But I like the fact that I write novels that really can't be filmed. They're books. They're meant to be read by yourself. And they're supposed to be, so they're not structured like screenplays.
Right, which is why Cloud Atlas and Winter's Tale should never have been movies.
They're just tough. Yeah, they're just really tough to make into movies, because I think part of it too is that they're so interior. They are so experiential. So it's hard to look from the. But there's a guy that I think is in the process of maybe optioning Tinkers, and when I talked with him about it, it was just so fascinating for him to just say, I've just been thinking about this, and for years I just could not figure out how to make this into a movie. And then he said, I became a father for the first time. And he was like, within 6 weeks of having becoming a father, I figured out how I think I could make it into a movie. Whatever. And for me, it would just be like, all I would care about is that a work of art that I made that was inspired, like that my informal understanding or personal definition of literary fiction is fiction that is inspired by and in conversation with other literature and art, right? If a work of art that I made inspires somebody to make another good piece of art, Tinkers is Tinkers. This Other Eden is This Other Eden, but if that refracts through somebody else's artistic sensibility and they make a cool movie or a cool play or a cool sculpture, that's awesome.
I'm obsessed with light as well. And the way you brought it in a clinical academic sense was really smart, because you had Ethan get the book.
Yeah. So Ethan is a painter. And I was just like,
that was kind of a trick. That was kind of a trick on your part.
Well, it was one of those things. Again, it's just that it's so practical. You just think of it in such a practical way, first of all, it's just sort of like artists love writing about art, and so you have to just be careful about just like going off. But I wanted the kid to be, he had to be a painter because he was a painter from, like I say, like some guy out in the meadow painting. I'm not going to turn him into a sculptor, or so, So then it's all these problems, like, oh, if you make it too painterly, or if it's too on the nose, like, so how do you, he can't be a painter in scare quotes. He has to be a real painter. And so what I did is I actually went back and I just found like an old painting textbook, right? And it has it's kind of, it has that kind of, like there's a riff about like when you're doing portrait art, do not, don't make an average man more handsome or a lady less, and there's this kind of, and so I just paraphrased some, that sort of thing, and just gave him some of the language that was in that about, how colors, when they're exposed to the sun, how they change and how they move around and that sort of thing. And just that gave me an excuse to have him noticing people's faces and how the color is always changing, and and just the world is always changing,
And the corollary of that is you have him sitting on the rock, and you have the bottle and the bird, and then he shades it, and then he gets horrible sunburn. It's like, I'm thinking, what the hell's going through this guy's mind when he's writing this stuff?
I know, it's just the weirdest thing. It's just riffing, and just a lot of it has to do too with,
it's like you're drumming. It's just like your drum kit behind you.
It's improvisation, and it's riffing, and as with music and dynamic, as with music, as with painting, it's working with counterpoint and juxtaposition, so if something's really, really bright and burning, you want like a little bit something that's cool and shaded, and you just put them next to each other. And it's experimental, sometimes it doesn't work, but a lot of times whatever you're doing, you just introduce a little bit of the opposite. That's in landscape painting, right? Usually the brightest part of the landscape is is one of the most distant points, and the closest to the viewer is dark, and so that's how you pull depth out of that, and in counterpoint in music you have dissonance or harmony, and that, so it's thinking about like these different elements, like that little scene, it's like a still life, so there's a little still life that's coming, but then there's a kid, and so it's just choreographing like a very finite set of elements. There's 6 or 7 things. There's the sunlight, there's the shade, there's the kid, there's the bird, and just permutating them and seeing what combinations, and how they imply one another, and how one leads into the next or follows from what came before it. And a lot of it is, it takes long time. I mean, one of the things I've been talking about more and more with my students, just thinking about myself, is I think that what we traditionally call revision is actually writing. Because you first draft, you never get it right when you put it down. You get it on to see what's wrong with it, sort of. Because people say, how many times do you revise? And I just, there's not a sentence in the book that I haven't worked over 100 times. Just trying to get just everything pitch perfect and moving though, and synthesizing with everything else. And again, just trying to get that maximum clarity and lucidity, but richness too. Again, it's like, I think of like, I've read Absalom a dozen times. Every time I love that feeling of, I can't touch bottom with this thing. Every time I just end up being like, I'm in over my head, and I love it. I can't quite, and there's all this stuff that I forgot was in there. And there is something of, kind of experiential about that. That's a book that has a richness that matches the richness of human consciousness. So that when, 2 years from now, a different me will be reading that book. And so I'll go through it slightly differently. And it's rich enough to accommodate those nuanced different readings.
Plus, you can do a book with economy of language as opposed to Faulkner, like say, The Old Man of the Sea, Gatsby.
Yeah.
And you still have the same feelings, like
right, exactly. Yeah. Right. That's the sort of thing. There are different aesthetics, or there's different styles, but what they can do with those. Yeah, like Hemingway was not a minimalist. There's nothing minimal about those books. It's just how his prose reads and looks, and the kind of tonality of it. But it's so rich in implication. It resonates.
That's a good word. Which reminds me, so like the New York Times crappy review of Enon, they're going like, this is not how grief is. And I'm going, who the hell are you to say that? But they say that as an absolute, like, what the hell?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's just what you run into that all the time. It's that sort of, Enon ran into that too with addiction, because the guy's just grieving and he takes a bunch of drugs and drink, and grief, again, it's experiential, right? You don't do this when you're grieving, and to which I would, in my mind say, that's absolutely true, unless you do.
Right, when he's in the funeral home and he's not sure whether he should call him.
Right.
Yeah.
Whatever.
You shouldn't do that when your daughter dies. I mean,
yeah.
You're not supposed to do that.
Yeah. And, and the times that I've grieved in my life, one of the things that's been very surprising is just how absolutely, like, unbearably lucid everything becomes. It's almost like you become hype. It's like too much. It's like the shutter of the camera is open. It's just like, it's like, I notice too much. But that always happens. Like, so grief there's no such thing as grief. There's no metaphysical, transhistorical entity or phenomenon of grief that people go through, and it's homogeneous. Grief is the name of something that is experienced by all humans, but uniquely. I mean, there's overlap, but
well, it's like the last few pages of Nausea by Sartre. It's like you said, it's just too much. It's just like too much.
Yeah.
It makes him. It's disgust. It's nausea, but somebody would say, you're looking at a tree. I mean, you're just looking at a tree. Right.
Yeah. And that's what you're just always asking the reader to go with it. I mean, I think that's, you can't write in with worry. Like another thing I say to my students is, don't write your books for bad readers, because one of the things that bad readers will do is it's the evil opposite twin of exegesis. It's eisegesis, which is you bring your thing into the book, and you're like, this is what I think a good novel is. And if you can't read the book on its own terms, if you can't take the time to try to discern what the terms are according to which the book is trying to do its thing, then you're always going to have an adversarial relationship with the book. So and that's what you get with like bad reviews, is just somebody comes in and says, this is what a novel should be. This book doesn't do that, ergo it's a bad book.
Correct.
As opposed to there's a great, Adam Hayes, not Adam Hayes, a friend of mine, great friend. I think of William Hazlitt slightly, but him talking about just sort of book reviews are just, writers, taking the piss out of other books to show, or showing how smart they are at the expense of these hapless books that come under their.
It's like a perfect paragraph, and I guess it was only a paragraph, is when Ethan offers the kid, the end of his cigarette, the deaf kid, and you have him sharpening the sides, and you describe it in this poetic fashion that other people maybe they will say, well, I don't, why is this in here, or something like that.
Yeah.
But
and that goes back to personal, like, I unabashedly want to make things that are beautiful, but in that Keatsian, truth is beauty, beauty is truth. So sometimes so it's not pretty. I'm not trying to write pretty things, but I do write, lyric, and a lot of it's pastoral. And, again, that's another challenge, is I want to make things that are beautiful, not pretty. I want to make things that are essential, not ornamental. And so when you go into those descriptions, like, that was just interesting, just like, what is the language of how you sharpen a scythe, and I just literally tried to get it. So
the word beard, I didn't know.
Yeah. The beard of again, I'm, one of a reader that I'm thinking of is it's just one of the ways that fiction persuades the readers of what it's giving them is true in that artistic sense, is that it's based in just very, very clear description of what does it look like, what does it smell like, what does it taste like, what is it temperature, what does it feel like. That's you want to feel like they're really, like that you're actually giving them an experience. Like when they're reading it, you want them to be thinking, oh my God, I'm like it feels like I'm right here, and I can actually hear the scrape of the blade and the kid, and you can smell the cigarette in the barn, and it's just like, and that's another thing. You get to those poetic things where it's sort of like the ocean dreaming of its own depth. You just get there and then I love the idea of just bringing my reader deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into these experiences, and just standing shoulder to shoulder and getting to these points where you're just like, look what I found. And not saying this is what you think of it, this is what it means. I try to make, no sentence stands for something else. Every sentence I write stands for itself. It means what it says and says it, But then you get to those places where you're just like, I don't know what this means, but I feel like I'm in the presence of very profound meaning, And I think that's a universal human situation where you're just like, you're just overwhelmed, and it's just like, I don't know what this is, but it's sure something.
And that's what, you just used meaning twice in a sentence. And then I'm thinking, well, does this book have meaning? And then I'm thinking of the cliche of Marianne Moore, a poem need not mean but be. A poem should not mean but be. Books are like that.
I think so. I think that there's that one of the ways I've been thinking, kind of a version of that I've been thinking about a lot, is just, to me, any kind of explanatory motive is fatal when I'm writing fiction anyways. I don't mean to, I can't, because to explain, if you're trying to get bring the reader and the everybody, all along to these points of like, just, the real mystery of what it's like to be a human. Who are we? Where, this is amazing. It's terrible, and it's amazing. It's profound. You've brought them you've brought them past the threshold where explanation is even possible. So any kind of explanation at a certain depth, it would be fraud, because it would be explaining away, or it would be coercing the reader into trying to, get on. So I just think, but this goes back to meaning. Like, I think we think explanation and meaning are sort of synonyms, or you get, you know, and I've just been thinking a lot, like, no, you know, description is meaningful, you know, and I just try, so that's one of the things I just do to entertain myself, you know, whatever, is how deep can I take description so that it just justifies itself. The description of something is the experience of it, you know.
I wonder if you could write a science fiction book, because it wouldn't be grounded in stuff that's already here, you know? I wonder if you could do that.
I don't know. It's, you know, I don't know. You know, it's funny because I'm kind of I'm not a comprehensive movie buff, but I like certain bandwidths of, you know, and I think like the first Alien movie is like the greatest movie because Ridley Scott is just so layered every time I watch it. And, you know, I like, after the guy blows up with the alien, I barely even watch it. It's just those first 45 minutes and there's space truckers and it's labor against me. And it's just so that kind of thing, you know, and just the beautiful composition of all the shots, you know, that sort of thing. So I like, you know, some of like Stanislaw Lem, right? You know, his, you know, there's one of his, his Master's Voice, which is this one about, you know, they must have gotten the idea for Jodie Foster's movie Contact, but it's, you know, the random noise that's in the universe that they use for when they need to generate sets of random numbers in scientific, you know, whatever. Stanislaw, it's just somebody discovers a repeating series of numbers in the background noise of the universe, and he just does that, and it's just like how kind of like society practically falls apart. So that kind of thing, or Calvino, you know, it's Italo Calvino.
Oh God, yeah, Cosmic Comics, yeah, and Baron in the Trees.
Forget it. And he said, I think it's not in that book of essays. Somewhere you know, there's an interview with him. And he said, I just take the world in which we live and I change one thing about the laws of nature. And the stories are about watching people like accommodate that, try to accommodate or be equal to that change. It's like the first sentence of The Argentine Ant, right? We didn't know about the ants when we moved here, or something like that. And then the ants are crawling all over the
it's like a Geico commercial.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I like that. In This Other Eden, I liked having different depths of field, different layers of magical realism, or not science fiction, but just, you know. And so there's one character, her name is Rabbit, and when she literally lives in a different genre or a different narrative plan. She's like from another story. And every time she's doing stuff that is not realistic. She eats animals, like she eats all this stuff. She'd be dead in 3 pages, you know. But I just let her sort of float. She's kind of ghostly, and I think of her as being from the island on the Tempest.
Exactly. I was just thinking, she's like a little Rosencrantz or Guildenstern.
Yeah, she's like one of the little, like one of oh God, now it's, you know, the who is Prospero's spirit? Ariel? No, not, is it Ariel? No,
Ariel, and then Caliban.
It's Ariel. Ariel is what I'm thinking. But just like all the, and you know, I love the fact that Prospero doesn't do any magic. He just has enslaved all the little magic fairies and gremlins and stuff like it. Whatever. We can do a show on the Tempest. But she is just, she's just like a little pixie or a little fairy or this little kind of like familiar spirit that is, she's part of the island, kind of. She's like
and I loved her. You know, you love her.
I love her.
It's funny because, you know, when you're talking about like Calvino, and who else was the other author we were talking about? Oh, Stanislaus Lem, they're seminal. And Tinker's was kind of seminal because your work is not derivative of anything that I know of. I'm not trying to compliment you. I'm just saying, to me, that seems like it. You're not going to read another book. I haven't read another book like Tinker's. I don't know what it would be.
You try to do that. And like with this new one, I this very elaborate personal kind of contraption in my mind where, you know, I teach the Old Testament, right? So it's Moses, but the books of Moses are all like rejigged versions of Babylonian mythology. you know? And so there's Moses looking at the oldest stuff that was already ancient to him, right? And then I think, oh, and now we have, and I then just jump forward a few sentences, you know, but Shakespeare, you know, the more I know about the Bible, the more I go, you know, I teach Hamlet and Lear and Macbeth, and it's just like, there's not a page of those plays that is not, it's Shakespeare using the Bible and refashioning so much of the Bible. You know, the scene at the end where Prospero forgives his brothers and everybody for usurping him is almost like word for, you know, beat for beat. It's Joseph forgiving his brothers at the end of the story of Joseph and his brothers in Egypt. And so it's just crazy. And so then you start thinking, now I'm watching Shakespeare, watching Moses, watching the Babylonian. And so there's something that becomes very, and then you read Moby Dick and you realize there's not a page of Moby Dick in which there isn't Shakespeare and there isn't the Old Testament. Like literally, it's, you know, it's not, there's nothing hidden. He's literally talking about Ezekiel and, you know, Ahab, who was the worst king of them all in the Old Testament. And then I think of Faulkner, you know, Faulkner's bear is, you know, is the bear is his Moby Dick, you know, and that, you know, there's the line in Moby Dick, the whaling ship was my Yale and my Harvard. And in the bear, there's the woods were his Harvard. You know what I mean? It's like, it's all out in the open, you know. And I think of Marilyn Robinson. You know, and I think of me looking at Marilyn Robinson, looking at Faulkner, looking at Shakespeare. So it becomes a relay of lenses almost.
Yeah. So I guess that's not seminal. That's a really interesting thing. You know, it's like Narnia, like where Aslan is Christ, you know, it's like,
yeah. So, right. And so it's this sort of,
but that's allegory.
Yeah, or it's all, I just think of it as how I get to have my cake and eat it too. So I get to wear the Shakespeare right on my sleeve. I get to wear Moses right on my sleeve, the Faulkner. You know, when people say, oh, it looks like you've been reading Emily Dickinson, I'm like, you bet your bootstraps I have. I'm delighted to be identified. But I work with those, you know, those inherited kind of that tradition. But then what you hope is that you realize I'm using familiar material, that's partly the basis for readers taking pleasure in what they read. But what you hope for as an artist is that you as an artist use them and arrange them and present them in a way that nobody else has seen them presented. So it's a new and pleasing and aesthetically pleasing or whatever arrangement of received materials, you know.
Well, I guess that's okay. Let's end it on, we could go on forever.
Yeah, we've just begun. We just set sail.
Yeah, we've been talking for an hour and 10 minutes. Okay, so yeah, let me just continue and end it with this. So I said inappropriately, I guess, not inappropriately, but wrongly, that your work is seminal, kind of as a compliment, but it's not. Your work isn't seminal at all.
Thank you. We've got to, no, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's a good last question, right?
Yeah, I just love being part of the tradition I'm part of, you know, just going more and more deeply and richly into that tradition, you know, and just, I don't know, you know, because you know, the more I teach the Old Testament, the more I just realize it's just inexhaustible. It's one of the, it's almost uniquely artful art and literary literature and poetic poetry. And the problem is, it's, you know, we've got that, we're in this time where it's just like it's a culture, it's weaponized, you know. So it's like,
oh God, yeah,
it's like, you know, don't look at the Bible, you'll catch a case of the stupids, you know. It's like, and you realize, you know, as a progressive liberal or whatever, that's how I used to be, you know, show that I was beyond all that. And then you start reading the thing, you're like, wait a minute, you know. And then what you realize is that one thing you can depend on when you know, with this stuff is that the antagonists of the Bible and the the people who are loyal to it, one thing you can count on is that none of them have read it. Nobody's actually read the thing.
No.
You know?
Although every year I read the New Testament, and the reason I read it because it's these four guys and they say the same thing, but they don't say the same thing.
Yeah, it's quadraphonic. Yeah. Oh, we could talk about, you know, because there were all sorts of efforts, you know, to actually consolidate them. There's a guy that was trying to make a thing, can't remember when, it was going to be called the Dia Tessaron, which is they just take all of the three synoptic gospels and just homogenize them into one, so that you don't, but if you're an artist, you know that the differences are actually what make it richer and deeper. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
It's not like, oops, you missed it or you're being inconsistent. It's you seeing it. It's when it's Joyce, it's parallax narrative, and it's the coolest thing ever because it's the same thing looked at from different perspectives. You know,
I mean, we could go on forever. It's like doing that would be like a tesseract imploding on itself.
Yeah. Yep. Oh yeah. I think that's another thing that I just, that took to heart is what I try to do with this other Eden, and just more consciously than with the other books, because I just, experience, I kind of know, I'm more aware, but, trying to make it so it's just irreducible. So you can't ever quite get to the bottom of it. It invites meditation. It invites rereading.
I got to think of a last question so both of us will shut up, but I can't.
I know.
Oh shit, I had one too. What was it? Oh man, I just had it in my head. It was a good last question too. Shoot, I forgot it. No, I can't. I can't answer now. Think of a good last question.
Oh geez, I don't know.
Well, go think of one. That's a good way to end it. You think of a good last question I should ask you.
Boy, that'd be interesting. I can't think of. I just can't.
Well, you have to.
How should people read your book or something like that?
Yeah. Okay. The classic one is, what should people take away from your book? But that's not what it is. It's like what I did last night, which is watching every Malaga YouTube video, reading Shakespeare, going down this term, I don't like it, rabbit hole thing.
Yeah.
Why am I doing that? Why can't I just read your damn book and be done, close it, put it away? What is it you write that makes me continue after the book is closed? What is that?
And the absolute ideal would be that I want to write books that make people feel privileged to be human beings and to have minds that can experience all that and be. I always want to privilege the reader. I always want to be courteous to the reader. I always want to dignify the reader. So I want, the perfect version is you go through the book and you feel dilated and you feel sort of inspired and hopeful, and your brain has been taken seriously. A work of art has tried to lay claim to the deepest and best of your attention and your thinking, and never betrayed your trust, and then you go, oh, I want to go read some of that. I want to look at those paintings. I want to listen to that music, and it's a gesture of fellowship.
It was like my favorite part of our first interview with Tinkers was, I was like kind of doing the same crap I do now. It was just the radio. And I said, since we're talking on the radio, what are you actually doing now? And you go, I'm folding my towels. And I said, so how do you fold them? And you go, well, I fold them in half this way, then I do this. I said, that's how I fold my towels. It was like we were on our first date. And
recognition is the most powerful thing. And that's what I said, I want my books to recreate in my readers the things that my favorite books due to my brain. I think of my brain as a filament, and this is your brain on Faulkner, and your brain lights up. And a lot of that is just recognition, and I say this all the time, but you get to the end of a book, a chapter, even a good sentence, and you just stop and you go, holy crap, that's absolutely true. I've always known it's true. I've never seen anybody put it into words or thought it. Exactly. But it's just that, that it's like revelation. It's like it's just like, of course.
Right.
But we'll talk again soon, and we'll try to get a drink.
Talk again in 10 years anyway.
Well, hopefully sooner than that this time.
All right.